Do you remember the first time you watched Platoon and realized you weren't being entertained? You were being pulled into something? Not the war as adventure you'd seen in older movies, but war as mud, confusion, fear, and the slow erosion of who you thought you were. Platoon, 1986. Hits like that because it wasn't written from a safe distance. Oliver Stone wrote it from memory, he served in Vietnam, and this film is his attempt to translate that lived reality into cinema without smoothing the edges. That personal DNA is the first hidden truth. The movie doesn't feel authentic by accident. Stone had been trying to get this story made for years, rewriting and pushing it through an industry that wasn't sure audiences wanted a Vietnam film that refused to be heroic comfort food. And when it finally happened, he didn't make a polished message movie. He made something that feels like being dropped into a world where you don't understand the rules yet, and that's exactly what the main character, Chris Taylor, is going through. Charlie Sheen's casting carries its own layer of meaning. Sheen wasn't just playing a young volunteer. He was also carrying a kind of Hollywood echo because his father, Martin Sheen, had starred in Apocalypse Now. Two different Vietnam nightmares, two different cinematic generations. In Platoon, Chris arrives believing he's chosen a noble path, and the film immediately starts dismantling that belief, not with speeches, but with exhaustion and moral pressure. And then you meet the two forces that split the soul of the film, Barnes and Elias. Tom Berenger's Barnes isn't framed as a cartoon villain. He's framed as the terrifying outcome of survival becoming your entire personality. Willem Dafoe's Elias, on the other hand, is not a perfect saint. He's a man trying to keep a piece of his humanity alive in a place that punishes softness. That clash is one of the movie's most important curiosities, because it's not just plot. It's the film's thesis. War doesn't only threaten your body, it threatens your moral compass. And sometimes the real battle is inside your own unit. Another thing many viewers don't realize is how deliberately Stone built the cast into something that would feel like a platoon instead of actors hitting marks. He brought in Vietnam veteran Dale Dye to run an intense military boot camp. The actors trained hard, learned to move like soldiers, carried gear, and lived with that constant physical stress before cameras even rolled. That's why their fatigue looks real. That's why their shoulders slump the way real shoulders slump when sleep becomes a luxury. The movie's realism isn't only the camera, it's the bodies. The location helped too. Platoon wasn't filmed in Vietnam. It was shot in the Philippines, where jungle terrain could convincingly double for the environment Stone remembered. The humidity, the mud, the constant discomfort. Those things aren't just set dressing. They shape performances. When someone looks miserable, it's not always acting miserable. Sometimes it's just Tuesday in the jungle. Stone also made choices that were quietly radical for a big-release war film. He doesn't give you easy geography in combat. The fighting often feels disorienting on purpose because that's what it can feel like on the ground. Noise, fragments, shouts, darkness, flashes. You're not meant to watch it like a strategy map. You're meant to feel like Chris, trying to keep up, trying to understand, trying not to panic. The soundtrack is another secret weapon. Platoon is famous for using Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings, and it's not used like background music. It's used like grief itself, swelling and collapsing in a way that makes the film feel like a funeral for innocence. And then the movie turns around and drops in era-defining tracks like Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit, not just to scream it's the 60s, but to underline the surreal, dreamlike horror of a young mind being overwhelmed by a world that makes no sense. The music isn't nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It's a time machine into the emotional weather of that era. And if you've ever wondered why the film feels so raw compared to other war movies of the decade, here's another reality-based detail. Stone wasn't interested in making you feel safe. He's not giving you clean hero beats. He's showing you a platoon where fear and boredom can sit right beside each other, where tension comes from waiting as much as fighting, and where the worst damage is sometimes what people do to each other when the rules dissolve. The performances also hide a fascinating before-they-were-legends layer. You're watching early work from actors who would become massive names. Johnny Depp appears in a small role. Forrest Whitaker is there. John C. McGinley is there. It's one of those films that, years later, feels like you opened an old yearbook and realized half the class became famous. That's part of its rewatch value. Every revisit reveals a face you didn't fully register the first time. There's also a structural choice that makes the story stick emotionally. Chris isn't an action hero. He's a witness. The film is narrated like a confession, like a letter you write when you don't know how else to process what happened. That voiceover isn't there to explain the plot. It's there to show the psychological shift, the way a young man's thinking changes when he's exposed to moral chaos for long enough. And because it's framed through his eyes, you're constantly pulled into the question. What would this do to me? The film's title itself is quietly meaningful. Platoon doesn't sound epic. It sounds small, almost administrative. That's the point. The movie is about the ground-level view, the unit-level truth, the intimate size of survival. It's not about generals. It's about the guys who carry the weight and don't get clean answers. Even the way Stone frames power inside the group is unsettlingly realistic. Leadership isn't always noble, sometimes it's dominance. Authority isn't always wisdom, sometimes it's fear wearing stripes. And the movie shows how quickly a young soldier can become psychologically dependent on the strongest personality in the room, even if that personality is poisonous. Because in chaos, people crave certainty the way they crave water. One of the most haunting elements is how the film refuses to let you believe anyone is untouched. The jungle doesn't just wear down boots, it wears down restraint. You see men laughing one minute and numb the next. You see the moral line blur in slow motion. And you realize Platoon isn't asking, who's right? As much as it's asking, what does this place turn people into? It's also worth remembering what the film became in the real world. Platoon didn't just get praised, it swept major awards including Best Picture and Best Director at the Academy Awards. That mattered because it signaled something huge. Audiences and critics were willing to face a Vietnam story that wasn't comfortable. The film helped reshape how mainstream cinema talked about that war, not with simple patriotism or simple condemnation, but with a brutal focus on the human cost and the moral fractures. And that's why, decades later, it still connects, especially with viewers who lived through the era or grew up hearing about it. It doesn't feel like a history lesson. It feels like a memory you're borrowing. It's the kind of movie where you finish it and sit quietly for a second because it didn't just show you a conflict. What's easy to miss the first time is that Platoon doesn't just show combat. It shows the slow, everyday pressure that makes combat feel inevitable. The waiting. The boredom that turns into nerves. The heat that makes people short-tempered. The way a simple patrol can feel like a coin flip between nothing happens and everything changes. That's why the movie feels so exhausting in the best possible way. It captures the rhythm of being trapped in a place where your body never fully relaxes. And Oliver Stone was obsessed with that rhythm. He didn't want soldiers who looked like clean movie soldiers. He wanted the cast to move like people who have been carrying weight for too long. That's why the pre-production training mattered so much. Under Vietnam veteran Dale Dye's guidance, the actors went through a boot camp-style program that forced them to march, sweat, follow orders, break down their egos and learn small habits that real soldiers pick up: how to hold a weapon, how to keep your head down without being told, how to conserve energy because you don't know how long you'll need it. The result isn't cool realism. The result is that everyone looks like they've been living in their gear. You can also feel the hierarchy inside the unit, and that's not just acting, it's a deliberate structure. The men who play the tough, hardened soldiers often carry themselves like they've been there longer. The newer guys feel a little looser, a little more naive. The film builds this social ecosystem where you understand status without anyone giving a speech about it. And that's one reason the Barnes versus Elias split hits so hard. It's not an argument between strangers. It's a struggle over what kind of identity the platoon is going to adopt to survive. Barnes isn't frightening because he's loud. He's frightening because he's effective, and the movie makes sure you understand why that's tempting. In a terrifying environment, the person who seems most certain becomes a gravitational force. Even if his certainty is cruel. Even if it's reckless. People in fear don't always choose the morally best option. They choose the option that feels safest right now. And the film turns that into a psychological trap. You watch men drift toward Barnes not because they admire evil, but because they're desperate to believe someone has control. Elias represents the opposite temptation, the temptation to preserve a piece of yourself. To not become the thing the war wants you to become. But the film is smart enough not to make him a flawless angel. He's still a soldier, still rough around the edges, still living inside a system that's grinding him down. That complexity is why the conflict works. It feels like a real moral argument happening under extreme conditions, not a simplified good versus bad lesson. A detail that deepens the nostalgia for many viewers is the way Platoon captures the era without turning it into costume party history. The music choices feel like emotional weather. When you hear Adagio for strings, it doesn't feel like a sad track. It feels like the sound of something breaking quietly, like innocence leaving the room. And when White Rabbit hits, it's not just a cool needle drop, it's the feeling of the world becoming surreal, like reality has stopped behaving normally. Stone uses music to tell you what it felt like to be young in a time where everything, politics, culture, war, was melting and reforming. There are also smaller song choices that make the film feel lived in, like the kind of tracks that would actually be playing among young soldiers trying to escape for a few minutes. Those moments matter because they remind you these aren't war archetypes. They're people who miss home, who crave normality, who try to build little islands of comfort inside a nightmare. It's the contrast that makes the tragedy sharper. You can see what they could have been in another life. The film's visual style is another hidden factor in why it sticks. A lot of the camera work feels immediate, close, slightly unstable, like the lens itself is trying to keep up. That's not just for intensity. It mirrors Chris Taylor's inner state. At the start, Chris is observing, trying to understand, trying to place people into categories like a student studying a new environment. As the film goes on, his perspective becomes more fractured. You can almost feel his moral confusion in the way scenes flow. Quick bursts of danger, long stretches of tension, then sudden eruptions of chaos. The structure becomes the psychology. And Platoon is full of small details that feel like, this had to be remembered, not invented. The way men talk to each other when they're exhausted. The way humor shows up as a coping mechanism, not entertainment. The way arguments flare over tiny things because everyone's nerves are raw. The way leadership can feel arbitrary, like the difference between a good decision and a terrible one is sometimes just timing and fear. These are the kinds of truths that don't need gore to be disturbing. They're disturbing because they're believable. One of the film's most haunting qualities is its moral claustrophobia. You don't get clean answers. You don't get a heroic soundtrack that tells you who's right. You get moments where you feel the discomfort of watching human beings lose restraint. The film forces you to sit with that without rescuing you emotionally. That's part of why it became such a defining Vietnam film. It refuses to tidy the war into a story that makes you feel good about understanding it. And when the movie reaches its most famous images, they work because the film earned them. The iconic shot associated with Elias, the one that became instantly recognizable, doesn't hit as a cool pose. It hits as an emotional symbol. A man caught between forces, a moment of helplessness, a kind of tragedy made visual. Stone frames it in a way that feels almost mythic, which is fascinating because the rest of the film is so grounded. It's like the movie briefly turns into a nightmare painting, then snaps back to mud and exhaustion. That contrast is why audiences never forget it. Another curiosity that adds to the film's power is how many of its actors were on the edge of major stardom, and how raw they feel here. You can watch it now like a time capsule and see future stars before the world decided who they were. That gives the film a strange double nostalgia. You're nostalgic for the era the film depicts, and also nostalgic for the era of cinema when these faces were still becoming themselves. And through all of this, Chris Taylor's narration keeps the story feeling like a confession. Not a heroic memoir, a confession. A man trying to explain how he changed without fully understanding it. He starts with ideas about purpose, about doing something meaningful, and the film slowly teaches him that meaning in war is not clean. It's not a poster. It's contradictory. You can do something brave and feel ashamed. You can do something cruel and tell yourself it was necessary. You can hate the enemy and still fear what you're becoming more than you fear them. That's the most unsettling extra truth Platoon offers. The war isn't only outside you. It moves in. It rewires your instincts. It changes what you call normal. And once that happens, going home isn't just a flight. It's a psychological crossing. You don't return as the same person who left because the person who left didn't know what it felt like to live inside constant threat. There's a moment in Platoon that sneaks up on you, and it's not a firefight. It's the realization that the jungle doesn't just surround the men, it starts to live inside them. You can see it in the way they stop talking as much, the way their eyes scan even when nothing is happening, the way small annoyances become explosions because everyone's nerves are stretched thin like wire. That's the kind of detail that makes the film feel less like a story and more like a lived-in nightmare. The danger isn't always bullets. Sometimes it's the slow, daily corrosion of patience. And the film's biggest strange fact is how it uses Chris Taylor as both the center and the outsider. He's in the platoon, but he's also watching it like a student dropped into a brutal classroom. At first, he's trying to make sense of everyone as if naming things will protect him. Who's tough, who's funny, who's crazy, who's kind. But Platoon keeps teaching him the same lesson in different forms. In war, labels don't hold. The kindest man can do something cruel. The toughest man can break. The loudest guy can be terrified. The quietest guy can become dangerous. It's not chaos for shock value. It's the film's way of saying human beings are more fragile and more unpredictable than any strategy. That's why the movie's sense of brotherhood is so complicated. It's not the clean, uplifting brotherhood of a recruitment poster. It's a brotherhood built under pressure, where loyalty and resentment can exist in the same breath. You can feel the friendships forming like survival tools. People cling to whoever makes them feel stable for a few minutes. Some bond through humor, some through anger, some through shared exhaustion, some through substances, some through sheer routine. It's a community held together not by idealism, but by the simplest truth: you're less afraid when you're not alone. And then the film takes that fragile brotherhood and starts slicing it with the Barnes versus Elias conflict. What's brilliant is how it spreads through the platoon like a disease. It's not just two men arguing, it's two philosophies competing for control over everyone's nervous system. Barnes represents the idea that you survive by hardening, by becoming ruthless, by seeing the world as targets and threats. Elias represents the idea that if you lose your humanity, you've already lost, even if you're still breathing. The movie never lets you settle comfortably into one side because it shows you the seduction of both. Elias' path can look naive in a place that punishes hesitation. Barnes' path can look effective in a place where effectiveness keeps you alive. That's the trap. That's why the film gets under your skin. The cinematography reinforces that moral trap. The jungle isn't shot as beautiful scenery, it's shot as confusion. The camera often feels like it's trying to find clarity and failing, the way a frightened mind tries to interpret noise and movement into a coherent picture. It's not the neat battlefield framing of older war films where you always know where everyone is. Here you're frequently unsure, and that uncertainty is the point. It mimics what Chris is experiencing, the feeling that reality has too many shadows and not enough answers. And when the film does give you clarity, it often does it in the cruelest way, through aftermath. You see the cost in faces, in silence, in the way someone avoids looking at someone else. Those little post-action beats are where the movie becomes emotionally heavy, because it shows that even when the shooting stops, the damage doesn't. People carry it in their posture. They carry it in the way they joke too loudly or don't joke at all. They carry it in how they sleep if they can sleep. One of the most unsettling aspects of Platoon is how it portrays boredom as danger. The waiting isn't neutral, it's gasoline. When nothing happens, minds start to wander into darker places. When you're exhausted, your sense of right and wrong can start to feel like a luxury you can't afford. That's why the film's quieter scenes can be more tense than the combat scenes. You're watching people sit, smoke, stare, laugh, argue, and you can feel the pressure building behind their eyes. It's like standing near a storm you can smell before you can see. And then come the moments that feel like moral earthquakes. Scenes where the platoon's internal logic overrides the world's normal logic. What makes these scenes so haunting isn't that the film tries to shock you. It's that it shows how quickly a group can slide when fear and anger have a target. That's the uncomfortable truth the film refuses to soften. War creates conditions where people can justify almost anything, especially if everyone around them is doing it, and especially if it makes them feel less powerless for 1 minute. Chris is the perfect lens for this because he's not presented as a born killer. He's presented as a young man who wants meaning, who wants to prove something, who thinks he's stepping into a noble hardship. The film then slowly twists that desire until it becomes something darker. The desire to belong, the desire to be accepted by the toughest people, the desire to stop feeling afraid. And that's one of the real, extra facts about human behavior. Fear doesn't always make you run. Sometimes fear makes you imitate the strongest person in the room, even if the strongest person is rotten. That's why Platoon feels like a coming-of-age story, but a corrupted one. In a normal coming-of-age film, you learn lessons and grow. Here, you learn lessons and lose pieces of yourself. You grow, but the growth is scar tissue. You become more capable, but you also become more numb. That's the tragedy of Chris Taylor. He doesn't become a hero in the traditional sense. He becomes someone who understands too much. The performances sell this because nobody plays their character as a simple symbol. Even the men who seem like stereotypes at first, tough guy, joker, scared kid, get little moments that reveal something human. A glance of doubt, a flash of shame, a quick kindness, a tiny panic. Those small moments are what make the film rewatchable. The first time you watch, you remember the big beats. The second time, you start noticing how many microbeats are doing the real emotional work. And here's a strange, almost poetic detail. The jungle itself becomes a kind of mirror. It reflects whatever a character is turning into. For some, it becomes a hunting ground where they feel powerful. For others, it becomes a prison where they feel trapped. For Chris, it becomes a crucible where he's melted down and reshaped. The film keeps returning to the same visual language, darkness, what leaves, heavy air, until you start feeling like the environment is a psychological state as much as a place. That's a rare skill, making geography feel like emotion. The music choices deepen that effect by constantly reminding you that the men were young, painfully young, and that they belong to a specific cultural moment. The songs aren't just there to make you nostalgic, they're there to remind you of the gap between what these men were supposed to be doing at that age and what they are actually doing. Listening to music, joking, dreaming, flirting, planning life, those are normal young person things. In Platoon, those normal impulses are trapped in bodies carrying rifles. That contrast is heartbreaking, and it's why the film lands so hard on audiences who lived through that era or grew up in its shadow. One of the most powerful qualities of the film is that it doesn't give you a clean emotional exit. The final stretch of Platoon feels like the moment when the movie stops being about a unit in Vietnam and becomes about a soul under pressure. Everything tightens: the jungle, the fear, the exhaustion, the anger inside the platoon. And by this point you realize the film has been preparing you for a truth that's almost unbearable. In war, the line between enemy and your own can blur until the scariest threat is no longer outside the perimeter. It's inside the group, inside the mind, inside the choices you make when you're tired enough to stop caring. What makes the ending so powerful is that the climax isn't a clean victory. It's survival in a storm. The combat becomes frantic and chaotic in a way that feels deliberately anti-cinematic. No elegant hero shots, no perfect coordination, no triumphant music telling you how to feel. It's noise, confusion, bodies moving on instinct. And that's exactly why it lands. The film doesn't want you to admire battle. It wants you to feel how quickly battle turns human beings into reflexes. And in the middle of that chaos, the Barnes versus Elias conflict reaches its ultimate consequence, because the film has always been pointing toward this: that war doesn't just kill people, it creates conditions where moral collisions become inevitable. The platoon can't stay split forever. Chris can't stay neutral forever. The film keeps forcing him to pick a side, not in a political sense but in a survival sense. Who do you become when you're cornered? Who do you imitate? Who do you fear? And the most brutal part is that even when you choose, you don't get peace. You just get the next problem. Chris' transformation completes here in a way that's both satisfying and tragic. He doesn't become a hero. He becomes a survivor who has seen enough to lose his innocence completely. At the start, he is looking for meaning, almost romanticizing hardship. By the end, meaning feels like a luxury. You can hear it in his narration: less idealism, more weariness. He speaks like someone who learned the lesson no young person wants: that the world can demand a version of you that you didn't choose, and once you become that version you can't fully go back. And this is where Platoon delivers its strongest emotional hit. It shows that the deepest wounds aren't always physical. They're identity wounds. They're the realization that you have done things, or watched things, that you will carry forever. The jungle becomes the setting for that identity fracture. The darkness isn't just nighttime, it's moral darkness, where choices are made fast and later you live with them slowly. The film's ending also reinforces something older viewers recognize with a heavy kind of nostalgia: the sense that Vietnam was not experienced as a story with a clean arc. It was experienced as a grind, a fear, a confusion, and for many, a lifelong echo. That's why the film became so culturally important. It didn't offer comfort. It offered recognition. It gave people a way to look at the war without pretending it fit neatly into a box labeled glory or shame. It showed that the truth can be both: moments of courage inside a system of chaos, moments of humanity inside a machine that punishes humanity. The final battle sequence drives this home through pure sensory overload. Flares, darkness, screams, explosions, fragmented orders. Feels like the world is breaking apart in pieces. The jungle that earlier felt like a slow suffocation now becomes a sudden collapse. You can't track everything, and you're not supposed to. That disorientation is part of the message. War doesn't give you the camera angle that makes sense. It gives you the angle you happen to have when everything goes wrong. And in the aftermath, Stone gives you one of the film's most haunting choices. He doesn't end on celebration. He ends on reflection. On a voice that sounds older than the face it belongs to. Chris is physically leaving, but the film makes it clear he's not escaping. Not really. The war has moved into him. He can be extracted from the jungle, but he can't be extracted from what he's become. That's why the narration lands like a confession. Chris talks about carrying two men inside him, two opposing forces that shaped him. Whether you interpret those forces as Elias and Barnes, innocence and brutality, hope and cynicism, it doesn't matter. The point is the same: war splits people. It doesn't just test you, it rearranges you. And you come out with parts that don't fit together smoothly anymore. The final images leave you with the kind of quiet ache that only the best films manage. Because the movie doesn't say, here's the moral. It says, here's the cost. And the cost isn't only the people who didn't make it home. It's also what the survivors carry home in their eyes. It's the way they can feel out of place in normal life afterward. It's the way a sudden noise can pull them back into that jungle without warning. It's the way they can miss the people they hated because those people were the ones who lived through it with them. And that's the film's most unsettling, most human extra fact. Trauma can create strange loyalties. You can resent someone and still feel bonded to them because they were there when reality broke. You can hate what you became and still miss the version of yourself that existed before you learned how far you could go. That's the kind of complexity the film dares to show, and it's why it still feels powerful decades later. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s, there's another layer of nostalgia to this ending. The era when Hollywood still made big movies that were unafraid to be raw, political, and emotionally uncomfortable. Platoon wasn't trying to be a crowd pleaser. It was trying to be an honest punch. And it worked. Not because it was perfect but because it was sincere. Sincere in its anger, its grief, its confusion, and its refusal to sanitize. So when the film ends, you're left with that strange silence in your chest, the one that happens when something has gone beyond entertainment. And maybe that's why Platoon endures. It doesn't just show you war. It shows you what war does to the people who survive it. It shows you that the real battlefield isn't only in the jungle. It's in the space between who you were and who you become when you realize there are moments where goodness doesn't feel easy, and survival doesn't feel clean. And if you've ever watched Platoon and sat there afterward, not talking for a minute, you already know that silence isn't boredom. It's respect. It's the feeling of having looked at something heavy, something real, and realizing you can't carry it without feeling the weight.